Hello, everybody. I'd like to introduce to you Guy Cools, who is, as you know, a dramaturge, performance dramaturge. How would you qualify yourself?
I call myself a dance dramaturge.
A dance dramaturge. And Guy Cools is currently in Montreal. I think you're teaching right now a workshop. Maybe you'll be able to, if you wish, go into that. And we're happy to have Guy because he works very closely with choreographers here and abroad, and in supporting the development of various choreographic choices and visions. And this is most appropriate for especially students in third year who are currently developing their own work and asking themselves a lot of questions about how to develop research and process. And I think you have a significant experience in this. You've worked with Janelle Chagnon, who taught here for a number of years. And you're also working with Lynn Snelling and rewriting dance projects. So I'm going to just turn it over to you and let you begin. Thank you, Guy.
I'll do it in English, but feel free also to ask me questions in French. Being Belgium, I know the importance of respecting the difference in languages and the coexistence of languages. I call myself a dance dramaturg. That's been the last 15 years of my career in performing arts. Before I started originally as a critic. After that I was for 12 years more a presenter, producer. But my original training was in dramaturgy, more theatre-based. And I've been asked, I think, today to talk about my vision on what dance dramaturgy could mean. And I have to start with saying that we live in a time that there's not one definition anymore that is generally accepted. Like definitions change from context to context, historically, geographically, and even on an individual basis. So what I can offer you is only my personal view, and even in my kind of, if I look back on the 10 years, my way of defining dance dramaturgy has also shifted. So this is the first thing I would like to say. The second thing I always say, like for me, in my understanding, any artist has to have a dramaturgical reflection or practice, but you don't need a dramaturg to do that. A lot of artists, also some of the ones I have collaborated with, are very capable of doing it themselves. There's even a contradiction that in the practice of dance dramaturgy, my experience is that you do your work best when you're less needed. So when they, in a way, and there's been a tendency, especially in Europe, to force choreographers to work with dramaturgs because it would improve their work. But I don't believe in that, and the dramaturg should never be an excuse or a necessity like that. So having said that, dramaturgy as a practice comes from the theatre, and there are kind of more traditional definitions that are still valuable. There's this notion of dramaturgy, that dramaturgy in the theatre context is basically the organization of the actions that happen in a play, and especially how the actions shift, and by doing so create the narrative. There's another beautiful definition, traditional definition by Eugenio Barba, who's one of the first theatre directors in the world, in Europe, who started to search theatre anthropology together with Grotowski, and he defines dramaturgy as the weaving together of the piece or the text, whatever that means. So creating the coherence like that. And these definitions are still valuable on the level of, I think, of an individual production, an individual project. For myself, I've come to understand dramaturgy. I try to define it in a larger definition of it. And for me, dramaturgy, in essence, is the way an artist reflects, but also practices, in order to develop his own language over a longer time, in whatever form or language he chooses to express himself. So for me, I also believe that visual artists have a dramaturgical reflection that musicians have a dramaturgical reflection. And again, as an artist, you're able to do it yourself, or often you have people around in your environment that fulfill that role without being called like that, or you can kind of hire something that you call a dramaturg, and then it becomes the embodiment of that role because you think that it's valuable for you. So it's about the mentality, like to be open to change and to transform your own process, your own language. This needs a kind of critical reflection on that language. So there's also this sense of being able to play with distance from your own process. And then it is also a practice, and that's, I think, the main thing I want to defend here. Dramaturgy has often been put into the corner of the theory, or the more conceptual approach, which again has a certain value, but for me it's also a creative practice. And you do it by actually going into the material, which, if you talk about dance, is the body. So like in my own practice, although I kind of originally had a very academic formation and only this part of my body was developed, in order to become a good dance dramaturg, I also had to, like, I think, access other parts of my body. And there's also a whole somatic approach that also becomes part of it, which people can develop on it. That's also like one of the reasons, like often I talk about the dramaturg also as like an alternative for the outside eye, but again this notion of the outside eye seems to be limited to one part of the body, and then also this the eye also being then too much, the eye of God is kind of one that has the wisdom, which is not at all true. Like I start to talk about being an outside body, and in some critical discourse in Europe, this is also being taken part of that. So this is one part. The other thing, there is a historical journey of dance dramaturgy, and I'm always talking from the European perspective, although I lived here in Canada for 6 years, like from 2004 till 2010. I grew up within continental Europe, which is also even very different from, for instance, a country like Britain, where they have a very different tradition as well. And dance dramaturgy as a profession, even there, is very young. I mean, the first documented cases is somebody like Raymond Hoge, who you might know, who worked with Pina Bausch, and they started to collaborate, I remember well, in '79. They collaborated for about 10 years. Like Raymond is now making his own work. There's another case of, which is my kind of role model, which is the Flemish dramaturg Marianne van Kerkhove, who is still practicing. She originally started with Andreas de Keersmaker, all through the 80s, like almost the first 10 years of Andreas' career, they worked together. But now Marianne is still collaborating with choreographers like Omar Sharifi, or Christophe Fort, who's a Belgian choreographer, making also more kind of installation pieces. And then there's also like Hannah Gilpin, who is the dramaturg of Foresight, and then we're already talking about the second half of the 80s. So the profession being relatively young, and then as I said before, like every dramaturg defines his practice like any artist defines his practice. So I think there may be some things in common, but then also we all have our own approaches that are very specific. I'll again explain a little bit more my philosophy first, and then I'll show you one example of a piece which is 0 Degrees, which is a collaboration between Akram Khan and Sidi Labri-Sherkawi, on which I collaborated, and I can also illustrate how I actually worked with them and make the role a little bit more concrete. So as I said, like my personal shifted from focusing on the production, on the work, to focusing on how do you accompany an artist so that he's able to continue to develop his own language. And now, more recently, my main focus is how do you offer people tools to reflect and transform their own creative process? Because my belief is if you kind of change the process, then the language will evolve, and then eventually also the work will evolve. A couple of years ago, I think around 2010, I was having a sabbatical paid by a personal development grant from the Canada Council, which I'm very grateful to them. And I was spending the sabbatical only on islands. I was spending it on the islands in Toronto, in front of Toronto Island, where there's an artist resident place. I was in Cortes, north of Vancouver. I was also in England, which is also a big island. And I was also in Cyprus and Greece. And especially when I was in Cyprus and Greece, I got inspired to find a way to discuss the creative process with artists. And I use 3 graphic symbols, like the cross, the circle, and the labyrinth, to talk about the creative process. And it's not, there's symbols to talk about it, so it's not that it is the creative process. And I started with the cross, and again, this was very much inspired by where I was in Greece. In Greece, they have what they call figurines, and these are little clay figures that they put in the graves to accompany the dead, and they always represent the human body. And some of these oldest figurines, they date from 3,000, 4,000 before Christ, they are represented, they're just figure of a cross. So the cross, before it became a religious symbol, is basically a representation of the human body. And it is a kind of the energetic axes of the human body. There's a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. And this is, again, comes back to a lot of cultures. And in my understanding, the vertical axis is a kind of representation of the knowledge, of our knowledge. And it always goes between heaven or air and earth. I'll come back to that later. And again, think about the 3 of knowledge in the Bible. So it's about a kind of embodied knowledge and a kind of intuitive knowledge that is not yet too defined, but that is somewhere out there that we want to grasp. And if this is the axis of knowledge, then the horizontal axis is the axis of the actions that we put into the world. And they seem to, again, in traditional thinking with the elements, you would put here water and fire, and it's basically the main polarities between a more receptive attitude and it's between a more active attitude. Think about yin-yang or female-male, but that's kind of, again, reducing it. So I think, again, the terms I put on them is just my terminology. You could replace it again. But for me, this opposition between being more receptive or being more active, and that we constantly shift from one to the other. Is that kind of clear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then I said, okay, if this is true, that this is a representation of who we are, then you should be able to apply it to all different activities, also to the creative process. And then again, for me, putting terms on that, I already mentioned that knowledge is for me like this, in a creative sense, always goes between intuition and experience, which for me, experience is on the level of embodiment, and intuition is okay, what we knowledge that is not defined yet, which we're unable to define, but which we somehow sense. And receptive active means between perception and what I call articulation, again, in whatever form or language you choose to do. And one of the things, like coming back to the workshop I'm teaching here now to professional people in the professional field, which is like the 6th time we do it in Montreal, and we've been doing it in a lot of other places in the world, where we do practical exercises with artists to help them think, reflect on their creative process, and then hopefully also change it. One of the things we do a lot is that we focus a lot on this aspect, because once you make a career as an artist, because of the pressure of the market, of having to produce, we always focus a lot on the articulation, and we forget, or we start to forget the perception side. And it's by again, opening up our perception, changing our perception, that eventually will also start to develop our articulation. Still clear?
Mm-hmm.
Just make sure, would you consider then that articulation is the product in a more like commercial terms?
Again, I would not. For me, it's a basic polarity that at any moment of the process, you're kind of, and again, like I believe in polarities, not in the Western way that they kind of are oppositions. They coexist, and even think about working in the studio. I mean, as a choreographer working with your dancers, you would kind of articulate, you would tell them, give them a task, and then you would use your perception, see what comes back to you, and you would re-articulate.
So it's more of a back and forth.
So it's constantly a back and forth, and again, I also believe when you put them in a scheme, it's like the scheme makes it too clean, because in reality it's much more confusing, and everything coexists like in a thing. And also on the level of perception, it's also about, when I come back, it's not just the eye, no, it's any form of sense that is active depending on which situation you're in. So if you have the cross, then like around every cross you can draw a circle. And again, in a way, in a schematic way to think about it, for me the circle suggests a certain chronology or logic in the way that these four polarities are, in an ideal world, connected to each other. But again, the ideal situation never exists. In a way that, I say, like, in my experience, having worked with a lot of artists, and also if I look at my own creative process, what triggers a creative process is always a moment of perception, where we observe something. It can be inside ourselves, a sensation, a feeling, but often it's also something outside of us. Another person, something that happens in the world, another work of art. So there's always a moment that triggers the desire to start to create, and this is always a moment of perception. And often, again, this seems to be linked to an intuitive sense that what we perceive outside of ourselves has some information, some knowledge that we want to make our own. And by kind of going into the process, we hope that we kind of make that kind of knowledge that is still intuitively also more embodied in experience. So the real challenge of the creative process is for sure that part of the circle, which is to find your own form, your own articulation for something that you sense intuitively, often by having perceived something outside of yourself. And then, again, this is my kind of philosophy. If you are successful and you find that form and you articulate it and you create something that is also there out in the world, through the process, what was intuitive becomes part of your experience, becomes embodied, so that, for instance, you could, if it's successful and you're happy with it, you could repeat it a number of times. But because it's also a work of art that you created, it can be perceived by other people, and hopefully you, in your turn, might inspire somebody else to create, so the whole cycle could repeat. And if you look at the history of art, I think that's often what happens. So people take something out of the previous generation or something out of a different discipline, transform it, and then again pass it on, inspire the next generation to work with it or other artists. That's still clear? It would be too beautiful if that's would be the reality. So that's why I introduced the third form, and that's the ancient Greek labyrinth, which is something like this. I always mess it up when I draw it in the end. So in English there's a big distinction between maze and labyrinth. When we think of labyrinths, you know, the labyrinths we played in as children are basically mazes, which is where you have to find your way. There are a lot of dead ends. But this is a much more recent form, which I think started in the Renaissance, especially in garden architecture. But there's a much older form where there's basically, what I'm drawing is basically the pathway that you would walk into the labyrinth. And there's only one way in towards the center, and there's only one the same way out. And this form, which you often find built with stones on coastal areas, in a lot of cultures, and it's in Greek culture, in Celtic culture, in Native American culture, in Indian culture. And there are a lot of theories about what it exactly meant, why it was built. But one of the theories that is generally accepted is that it is a kind of a choreographic pattern for a ritual that was always related to creating a new human settlement. So it was about centering yourself as a community to settle down. We did some research with that in 2002 in Greece with actors and dancers, like building this labyrinth and then walking it. And again, what I learned from it was this simple notion that it is the pathway we go, and there's a movement that's clockwise, and then there's the next movement is anti-clockwise. There's a movement that kind of approaches us to the center, and then the next movement takes us away from the center. So it's this kind of basic thing that a bad day follows a good day, and both are needed to eventually arrive. And again, if it is also kind of a beer rhythm, like because that's also these labyrinths, and also, I mean, there's a whole new wave culture about it. Sting has built a labyrinth in his garden and walks it every day. So there's also an understanding of your own beer rhythm in relationship to the rhythms of nature and the cycles of nature. And it's again, but on the level of creative process, it is. So I think ideally you should put that and that together and make a kind of three-dimensional model of it, where everything is kind of whirling because it's an energetic thing, and you're somewhere on that journey, playing with these polarities. Is that kind of clear? Any questions, comments?
What was the third symbol?
The labyrinth.
Then what was the second one?
So the cross and the circle.
Oh, the cross.
And what was the first one?
Like why the clock?
Okay.
Okay. I come back now to my experience. What do I do as a dramaturg in this model? So I said, for me, okay, this is the challenge of the artist, which is like to find a form for something which is still unknown and just intuitively sense. It's a very challenging, and also there's a lot of vulnerability in that process. There's a lot of risk taking there. So as a dramaturg, I feel like in the beginning of the process, I should stay most of the time in this kind of part to support that part, which means that I don't want to articulate anything myself. If I want to be an artist myself, I shouldn't be a dramaturg, which I think is one of the conditions. So I stay mainly on the receptive side of being a witness of that process. And I will try to ground the process in my memory, in my understanding of my knowledge of that other processes that artist did before, because I've worked with him before, processes I went through with other artists that are similar, or the process itself. Like one of the things I've come to understand is like feedback, which is one of the things you do, is only relevant if it's feedback inside the process, so that you help the artist to remember previous moments in the process in order to get back on track. Because sometimes it's because people lost confidence in older ideas or just forgotten them, and then just by remembering them is often the best way to bring them a step further like that in their own labyrinth like that. So in general, I define when I work on a production, on a process, there are like three different functions, which again, there seems to be a certain chronology, that the first function is more in the beginning of the process and the last function is more towards the end, but the reality is not like that. For sure, they are more shifted. So the first one, I already mentioned, is purely receptive, being a witness to to the process, which means really just being present in the studio, seeing what happens, but without interfering. But already, being a witness, you kind of influence what's happening. And that's, for instance, one of the things that I call my practice also somatic, because there's a lot of energy just in the act of watching. When you're in the studio, like choreographer and a dancer are together, there's a third person watching their interaction. Both sensing that presence will change their articulation. They will think twice what they say. They will be more performative. And then once you understand that, I can play with my intuition, with playing that distance to the process by making myself feeling very felt, or allowing myself to disappear so that they kind of forget that I'm there, or playing with the physical distance, like being in the process on a regular basis and then disappearing for some time and coming back to that. And that's partly organized, but also partly using my intuition to that, and in a way also influencing the process by that, even without having saying one word. So this is this witness function. The second one, which again has nothing to do with placing it, but is being a dialogue partner. So the main thing I do in most of the processes is that I talk with the choreographer. There's also just another side remark. As a dramaturg, this is my choice. I'm there only for the choreographer. I'm there not for the dancers. It's my own choice in the sense I've seen in a lot of rehearsal processes, also in the more traditional situation with the rehearsal director, that the dramaturg or rehearsal director becomes the go between the choreographer and the dancer, so that whatever they can't articulate directly to each other, they try to communicate, articulate it through and this is a position I'm not interested in. So I want them that they can have a direct relationship as possible. If I see as a witness that there's some communication issue, I will tell the choreographer and I will support him or her to find ways to improve that communication with the dancers. But what I do mostly is talk with the choreographer before the process, the rehearsal process, after the rehearsal process, and in the dialogue we try to define where we are in the labyrinth and what is the best way to continue. And I start the dialogue as early as possible. So ideally, some of the processes started years before we actually went into the studio, because it's just about what are the ideas, what are the sources that would inspire me, looking at that, and then eventually it grows and grows. And with an actual rehearsal process, again in the studio I don't interfere, but on a regular basis, can be daily, can be weekly. Outside of the rehearsals, we sit together and we discuss. And also there, the shift went more from, not from what is the final piece, but how can we improve the process or the way of creating. These are general principles, and any principle has to you have to throw it out in order when it's necessary. So when the choreographer thinks it's useful for me to interfere, I will interfere. In a small, intimate process, I've worked with process where there's one dancer, one choreographer, and me, and there's no reason to organize that dialogue separately. Then the dialogue is all the time with 3 people involved. The dialogue partner for the choreographer also becomes often functional as a moderator between the choreographer and the rest of the artistic team, where again, 0 Degrees is a good example. We have 2 strong personalities with both choreographers. There's a visual artist who's a major visual artist who never collaborated for a dance piece before, and there's a very important. There's also a very talented composer. They all have very strong visions, and that often originally don't agree. So then my role is to organize the communication, and as a good moderator, again, not add my my own voice to it, but support the voice that I think is most relevant in finding a solution for a particular issue or a particular problem in the process. Still fine? When do I become more articulate? It's more towards, often most at the end of the process, if needed, because again, quite a lot of the choreographers I work with are capable of doing it themselves. Then I compare myself to that of a film editor. There's a book that has always been a big inspiration for me, which is called The Conversations. And it's basically a series of dialogue between Michael Ondaatje and Walter Merv, who's the film editor for all the Coppola films, but also for The English Patient. And it's about the art of editing. And again, a good editor doesn't add his story. It's the film director's movie, it's his story. But the film editor has certain knowledge, certain tools, certain capacities of how to help to organize the material. And often that's what you then do towards the end of the process, and then you come back to these traditional definitions of the weaving together of the piece, where you again help to clarify that. And as I said before, that this is the kind of, there's a chronology, but it has happened with choreographers that we started thinking about how to organize from already at the very beginning of the process, because it was a necessary part of how do you want to organize the ideas before they even have been emerged or created.
And Guy, has it ever happened that you've had strong feelings or opinions around near the end of the process that differ greatly from the artist, and how do you negotiate that?
I mean, again, I would always be in your role. You advise, you give your opinion, but you respect that the artist takes it in every way he wants and makes the decision. Two examples. We had one process with Les Balisés de la Baie, which was a piece that's called Bash. It's very successful, only with guys. Was presented here in Place des Arts years ago. Towards the end of the process, the group, it was not me, but the group had the sense that the solo of the choreographer himself should be cut because it didn't fit the musical arc. And again, the group kind of convinced the choreographer so that he kind of eliminated his own solo out of the piece. He used it later on for another piece. So whenever you kind of, there's always also this relativity. If you don't use an idea or cut it out, if it's an important idea, it will come back in another work. So this is one example. Another example is when we worked with Sidi Larbi-Cherkaoui on Myth, which was a big epic piece with like 21 performers on stage. And the material originally was created very much in this kind of scientific laboratory situation where all the dancers created material without anybody directing them. And after the first month of research, there were like 55 full-length sections. So if you put them all one after the other, it was like 5 hours material. And then Sidi Larbi said, okay, because of this particular theme, because of this particular process, because of these particular people, we're not going to cut anything. And everybody, me included, were like arguing with him, we can't do that. It's too much. But he was stubborn. He said, no, and he argued also. There were reasons that because he had this idea. I want this kind of encyclopedia of images, and I want the audience to choose their own images out of it. I don't want to kind of. So then, if that was his choice, then as a team we had to find a way to organize that material that it would still make sense, and in the end so it was about then finding ways to have the material coexist spatially, time-wise, so that in the end the show was 2 hours, and I think we on to a certain, whether it's successful or not is always not just, but we managed, at least for us, to a level of satisfaction to organize all of the material as two examples. Any other questions?
Do you actually bring up these images when you work with choreographers? Do you explain a bit like how this has evolved and how you apply it to your work.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, one of the things I do now most is this, I teach this workshops on creative process to professional people in the field, and then this is part of how I frame, and then what we do basically is, like the one that we're doing now involved in, is that we do a lot of practical exercises that are not there to generate material, but are just to generate reflection on this process. And then, like, as I said, certain exercise will like focus on what does it mean, if you, what happens if you change your perception, how does your articulation change, and so on.
I have a question. Are you aware of the repère process that Robert Lepage uses? It's kind of inspired by the RSVP cycle and the Robert Dunn kind of approach.
I know very little about Lepage's process, and I think there's, especially in this, I mean, I've seen the results, and I've read about like interviews, and I think there's a similarity. The question, there's something I forgot to tell. Again, historically, within the European context, there are like two big schools of dramaturgy. And there's one where they call the German school, and it's kind of conceptual dramaturgy. And basically, the dramaturg, together with the director, try to define in advance like what the piece will be. And then the rehearsal process is kind of trying to realize that concept. I belong to a very different school, which is, I think, similar to the way how Lepage works in theatre. And we define it as open dramaturgy. And there is this kind of great definition of Marianne van Kerkhove, which I just like to read for you because there's no reason. It's the best way how it's been defined. So I always refer back to it. The kind of dramaturgy that is familiar to me has nothing to do with the concept dramaturgy. It has been fashionable since Brecht in the German theatre. The kind of dramaturgy I relate to and that I have tried to apply in theatre as well as dance has a process-based character. One chooses to work with materials from different origins. Texts, movements, images, objects, ideas. The human material, the actor, dancers, is clearly the most important. Their personality rather than their technical abilities is the basis for the creative process. The theatre director or choreographer starts working with these materials during the rehearsal process. He or she observes, perception, how these materials behave and develop. And it's only at the end of the process that a concept, a structure, a more or less defined form reveals itself. And that's clearly the form that I've been applying. And it's particularly, I think, applicable to dance. But then again, there are exceptions. When we worked with Akram Khan and Juliette Binoche coming from the film, and again, in general, you have to be careful with generalizations, but actors, in my experience, always need more security from the day one of the rehearsal process. So she wanted to have a script. And then the whole process was about fighting with her to let go of that and be flexible enough to integrate whatever happened in the process. And that was only done it was not so successful in my personal opinion, because she was kind of, again, coming from this different world and having a lot of insecurity about it.
Did she decide to hold on to the toilet section?
And it was also like not only the toilet section, but there was like a lot of other, all the stories that she brought in were her personal stories. And personally, I think okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, I could.
Do you ever work from? Hello, Guy. Do you ever work from documentation? Like, I know you travel a lot. And do you always have to be in the studio, or sometimes do you work from like actual video documentation with the choreographers? Or is it always like the human presence is like the essential aspect of your work?
I think it's an important part. Again, originally I said I was very principled. I said like I have to be there at least 2/3 of the process. I have to be there full time in the beginning of the process because that's when all the ideas emerge. And again, there's this notion also that as dramaturgists, keep the memory, the archive of the process to help, by remembering it, help it further on. So if I'm not there when it starts, it's hard to bring back that. I want to be there at the end because for this editing process, and in between I can play with being present or absent, but still on a certain regularity. Today I'm more inclined to be more flexible with that attitude, especially if it's with people that I've had already a long relationship with before, so that I know well enough, so that I can come in, for instance, with Cindy Larby now, because he does most of this stuff, he's able to do it himself, and then sometimes at the end of the process there's a crisis moment and I'm called in. I wouldn't do it with any other choreographer, but I know him well enough and I trust our dialogue that I can come in and then be supportive for whatever he needs me to be supportive at that moment, like that. So it's again, what you're saying is also this. I've been also experimenting, playing with how do you organize the dialogue. With most people, it works best talking to them, but some people are kind of, I mean, again, a lot of people are in dance because they're not so articulate with words, so they need another approach. I worked here, for instance, I can say that, I think he wouldn't mind. I worked with Marc Boivin here a couple of times as a dramaturg for an improvisation project, which is again a whole different. So it wasn't again, it's not about the final result, it's just about the process. And with Marc, again, knowing each other very well, we came, and him needing a certain time. So what we do, like I would go into the rehearsal the whole day. At the end of the day, I was still living here at that time, I would kind of write him, and it was not even feedback in the literal sense, it was just whatever I thought was useful for him. I would post it in his mailbox the same evening or the next morning, and he would read my notes before going into the studio, and then decide to use them or not use them. And that was a kind of how he organized our communication all along the process. So, I'll talk a little bit about 0 degrees, and so also make it more concrete. It's just one example, but I think it is until today the process I most enjoyed working on, so it can also illustrate a little bit more concretely how we work together. Akram and Larbi, they started their career almost at the same time, around 2000. They got very quickly in touch with each other. I think originally because Akram was looking for a dancer and somebody had suggested him Larbi, so he contacted him, but then Larbi had started to make his own work, and this didn't happen. But they discovered very quickly this kind of, that they had a similar background as an artist, but also having a Muslim background, growing up in Western Europe and having to negotiate these two things. So they developed very early a friendship, and kind of starting to meet each other, to look at each other's work. And over a period of 3 years, before they actually went into the studio to create, the desire to work together kind of was kind of growing. And also in this period of 3 years where they were just getting to know each other, they would already go into the studio, I think in total about a month, spread out over 3 years, like trying out ideas before they had actually decided that they wanted to create something together. So by the time that they went into the studio, there was a very strong relationship, and they had already shifted things that they liked and didn't like, and they had a very clear idea of what they wanted to do together. Originally they had decided to work without a dramaturg, and it was at a very late moment that they decided that they did need to bring someone in, and I was for them the obvious choice because I had a kind of personal relationship with both of them, having produced and presented their first creations. So I was invited to the process, and like from day one it was clear that basically they wanted me as a moderator, because they knew that eventually they would kind of have potential conflicts or difference in opinions, and they wanted me as kind of in between, so that and they trusted me that I would kind of not favor one for the other, and that was very much my role all through that process. So when they went into the process, from day one there was a very simple, clear idea about the narrative. It was a story that Akram had told to Larbi about his first journey to India at the age of 20, having grown up as a second-generation immigrant in London, and the kind of experiences that happened on that journey. And Larbi had already developed this kind of part of his signature where he would just ask his dancers to tell a story for the first time around a certain theme or a proposition, film it, and then ask them to recreate the story exactly as they told it the first time, which he took from one of his teachers, which was Fernand Schirren, which is a very important rhythm teacher in Belgium, who was originally a rhythm teacher at Mudra, the dance school of Béjar, and then he was re-invited to be the rhythm teacher in parts, with André Kersmark found in parts. And Schirren had this philosophy that the basis of choreography is the hand movements that we make when we're talking. And so Larbi took that idea literally and said, okay, like, I ask people to tell a story and I film them and I ask them to recreate that. It looks very simple, but it's hours and hours of work because there's so much detail and unconsciousness, so to make that unconscious in a natural way. So that was already there. And then both of them had a lot of ideas about particular movement research they wanted to do. Like Akram, in the traditional form of katak, there's spinning, so he wanted to research the spinning, but in a different, new way. Larbi wanted to learn from him some of the footwork in katak. Already at that time, they were both very inspired by Bruce Lee, so they wanted to have some kung fu movements in it. They were actually taking classes with kung fu teachers in London. So there were all this kind of movements idea, and I think part of their success is that they work extremely hard. They both work alcoholics. They work like 7 days a week only for their art, but they also trust their own intuitions a lot. So if they say like, this is the idea, they will stay with it, and there will be moments that they get lost and they kind of lose trust in it, but they always go through it because it's eventually, stay with the first idea, and if you develop it far enough, it will have some value, no matter how naive or simple the idea looks like in the beginning. So that's what happens, and maybe we'll look first at part of the piece to give you an idea. I will show you two fragments, basically the first 10 minutes, which is the first part of the story, and then one or two movement sections, and then the very end later on in the talk, so that you have an idea of the overall arch.
Can we start again?
Yeah.
I mean, in the very beginning, the sound captation of the video of the deep is not so good, so I think it gets louder.
Did you
sound,
say at the very beginning the sound isn't
no,
as
it
clear?
catches up like after a couple of seconds.
Ah,
so
okay,
it's always
okay.
in the beginning that's a little bit.
Sorry.
It's nice to see.
Yeah.
But what was interesting was that their expression on their face made them very powerful. And actually, it's an expression in the eyes that says, that kind of made me feel like, what I was saying to me, like, You are under my control, and you know it. So don't upset me. Don't even grab my attention, because you will feel the consequences. Actually, that kind of eyes they had, and what was interesting was, even on the way back from coming in from India, I studied their eyes a little more, and they really were soulless, and they really were, depends. Their eyes changed depending on the mood. So if any of them was like, I want to pick on you, they'd pick on you. Their eyes would say it. So, I felt already this tension. It was already hot. The sun was up, and I could feel this real tension between the people who were congregated from the bus, who would drop down from the bus, and these kind of guards that were on the sides. So anyway, we stand up in the line, and everybody quiets down a little bit. And this guard comes around and takes our passports. And I'm like, why do we have to give our passports? And they say they have to check it. My cousin just give it to them. I know these are the regulations. And then eventually we gave them, I was convinced by him to give it to them, so I gave it to him. And he walked around and gave it to another guard, who gave it to another guard. And I'm like, fuck, he has my passport. Suddenly I realized how vulnerable I felt. Because if that passport disappears, where is my proof of identity? They could just say I'm Bangladeshi, I'm a bandit. It's amazing how much a passport holds, how much power a passport holds. A passport holds between a good life and a bad life. Between life and death, I mean, it holds everything in just a piece of paper. And it was just incredible how much I wanted to hold on to it. My eyes were like a hole. I studied it, as it was passed passed from one guard's hand to another guard's hand to another guard's hand. And my passport was different because it was red. So I could study it. I could keep track of it. But the other passports were Bangladeshi because predominantly, the predominant nationality of these people who were congregated there were Bangladeshi, so they're the green one. So I studied it as it went to the top. And the guards at the top were putting stamps on it. And suddenly there was this rush of people that went towards the guards, except it was kind of put to stop by other guards. These guards suddenly formed lines and said, no, you have to wait. Because suddenly people started to panic, like, I don't know what was happening. Basically, it was chaos. And my cousin just grabbed me and said, hold on to me. And he said, can you see your passport? So he gave me a bit of a push-up. Actually, I go to his shoulder, I kind of took up, I said, yeah, my passport, your passport. I don't know where your passport is. So anyway, we said, listen, fuck, let's just get out of it. Let's just wait.
just
Recuing it.
so just to tell a couple of things that happened in the process, and it also kind of hopefully clarified the role you can play as a dramaturg. I told that they'd invite me to be a moderator, so I would have kind of discussions or talks with them, dialogues. Individually, I was staying in the same apartment as Larry. We were making the piece in London. So in the evening we would talk together like one-on-one. With Akram, because I did 3 more productions after this one, we have our dialogue whenever we had a cigarette and have to go outside. And that were kind of in the moments. So you also find moments kind of that organically feel where you can have a one-on-one and be together. And then for sure we also had a lot of discussions with 3 of us or even with the larger team. As a dramaturg, you don't give answers. It's really about, I mean, if the artists find the answer themselves, it's always more powerful. But you do ask questions. So one of the things I remember very well, and I think that was also appreciated, was that we had this narrative of Akram, and one of the first nights when we came home in the apartment, I said to Larbi, okay, we have Akram's story, but what is your story? If this wants to be a kind of a meeting, like on all levels equal, then you also have to have a story that kind of find a way to integrate. And first he was kind of quite evasive, and he said to me like, I tell my story through the stories of other people, which I kind of didn't accept as an answer. And then he kind of said he had a story, which was a song that he wanted to use. And the song is the semi-official anthem of Israel. And he wanted to use that song because as a way to reach out to the other, having been Arabic himself. It was also on a more personal level related to relationship with his father. And also he had already done some research and found out that that song, although it was claimed to be an original one, went back to another older song, which is a Basque song. And again, this was part of his philosophy also, that his coexistence, that there's always an origin of where we come from. Everything goes back to something else like that. So then that song was put onto the table without knowing how or when we were going to use it, but that was an important thing. As I said, there was a narrative of Akram, where we very simply then decided we're looking where can we cut it up and how can we spread it over the piece. In the end, there were like 3 parts that each found their place in the story. And the movement sections were developed independently, and in the process, eventually found each connection sometimes with something in the narrative, sometimes it's very concrete. There's a fighting section with Kung Fu later in the story. There's an argument between Akram and his cousin and the guards at the border. So sometimes the connections were kind of very concrete, sometimes they were more abstract. And also like the themes, they were not defined in advance, but they crystallized as the process went on. There was this theme of identity, of being similar and different, of mirroring each other. So that was kind of, again, it's as the process goes on, it clarifies what you kind of make. There was a beautiful whole dialogue with Anthony Gormley. You don't really know him, he's a major British sculptor, but he had never collaborated in a collaborative process for a piece on stage. And although he loves dance, it was very new for him. And he would kind of come into the studio every couple of days and have this idea and interrupt the whole process, which was great. There was one idea for a particular scenography that Larbi adored and liked, Akram hated. So for weeks there was the discussion, are we going to use it or not? And again, then at one point somebody's more stubborn than the other, so we said we're not going to use it. And then it was the frames that Larbi then used for Babel, which is like a couple of productions later. So again, there's something about when you give up an idea, if you really think it talks to you, you use it in another process. And like this scenography is very much again based on. I mean, Anthony works a lot with making molds of his own body to kind of pass it on. So there was another proposition that to make. We call them dummies. They're actually casts of both their bodies, like real size. Even have a skeleton. The weight is almost exactly their own weight. And that was his proposal. But we had, again, these dummies were there until very late in the process. We had no idea what we were going to do with them. Maybe we were going to hang them up and it would just be an installation in which they move. But then they did find, towards the end, a very different and I think important function. So this was kind of the whole big part of the process was just that, creating the material, trusting it. And then there's always, for me, the two things. First, I've become very passionate about taking your time to create the transitions from, I mean, again, it's not a general thing, but often we create sections of work, and then towards the end we find a way to edit them. And often because we don't have enough time, we don't really work with transitions, and then if the transitions are kind of made too fast and or all more similar, then it kind of flattens the whole work. So I always encourage choreographers to plan the creation process so that at the end there's really a lot of time, sometimes even weeks, just to work the transitions, and that every transition should be unique. That can be a cut, but can also be a whole section in its own that is generated to make this link between two sections. That's something we did here. And then the other kind of decisive moment is always when you move from the studio into the stage and all the changes or problems that arise from that. And in this particular case, there were a lot of issues that only came up like the last week, 10 days, when we moved from the studio to the big stage, because it was created for the big stage of Sound as well. I mean, the first thing was that with this wide, big, empty box, they felt very lost, and they needed some. They had each other, but there were also moments when you have solos. So that was when we came up. Okay, maybe we have to use these dummies. You see an example later on. You have to maybe use them in a more active way, because it's the only other reference point that you have in the space, like to relate to. So then the dummies became. Although they had explored and played with them, but then they had abandoned that idea, so the idea came back. So okay, let's work with these dummies in a more active way to create transitions, but also to help us space ourselves in this huge, wide universe. Another problem that we were faced up with was that like 4 live musicians. They were with us like 7 weeks in the process, and all the music was kind of created parallel to the dance. So that's always very rich experience. And Akram, in his classical katak work, which is basically an improvised dialogue with the musicians are equal partners, so they're always are very visible on stage, frontal. So he wanted them to have them also visible. But whenever we tried different things, again, trial and error is the best way to find out whether something works or not. So we're trying out to put them in the space, but each time we did it, it would break the symmetry or the universe, which was so much about this mirroring of 2 bodies and then each body having a dummy. So then at one point, the solution was, okay, there's a kind of shadow world that they're creating themselves, but we make the musicians part of the shadow world. They're a lot of the time they're not visible, but sometimes they just appear and disappear. So that, and again, you will see how we have used that towards the end. Any questions or comments?
Considering the dummies, the playing with the dummies came in so late, the articulations on the dummies are different, right? Was this part of, like, when they were created, was part of, we want to play with them, and this has to be practical in that way, or was it to represent the differences in identity?
It's a very good question, a very beautiful story. Basically what happened is that, it's just pure coincidence. What happened is that, because of practical reasons, one dummy was made weeks before the other one. And they were in the studio, and they had kind of again, they hadn't played with him. So one dummy was kind of already kind of half destroyed by the time of the premiere. But then, well, the other one was still very clean and very erect. And then that became kind of like accident meaningful. And there's a beautiful documentary about the making of, which is for sale. I think you can order it online in the bookshop of Sallis Wells. And you see actually, like at one point, very late in the process, this one dummy already falling apart, and then Anthony's decided, okay, now let's instead of kind of try to repair it, we're going to reinforce it. And we'll just cut up his limbs so that it becomes even more floppy and sloppy. And then also the way they're using this, again at the end scene, you will see the one is very erect and the other one is kind of a dead corpse that is kind of falling apart in the arms of Laura. So it is again also the accidents, like really be, which is again about this perception thing, like be very perceptive for what happens in the studio, and often a lot of the accidents are things that really contribute to the final work that you wouldn't have thought of if you had tried to conceive it in advance. Other questions or comments? So maybe let's go to the last part. I mean, I think the whole piece is worthwhile looking at, but with the time limit we have. So now jumping to the last 10 minutes of the piece. What is important is that the end of the story of Akram is, so he's on this journey, he passes the border, they're on a train journey to Calcutta. And on this train, he's confronted for the first time of his life with a dead body. And so 2/3 into the piece, which is the end of the story about the identity, the journey, then the piece becomes about this dead body. And after he finishes that story, they kind of create what I call a contemporary lamentation for this body in different forms. First they tell it, then Akram retell it in Abhinay, which is a traditional form of Kathak to tell a story. And then what you see now it's later on is a section with the dummies that we created really in the last couple of days. And then the final section. This is completely inside.
Oh.
ירושלים של זהב ושל נחושת ושל אור, הלא לכל שיריי אני כינור.
So yeah, again a couple of, as I said before, the section with the dummies was really created in the last week of rehearsal as a transition, but also because we felt at that point that we needed some contrapoint there. Like the music, as you saw after, is very strong. The music before is very strong, so we need some musical contrapoint or some a longer section in silence. And then there was also we were building up this kind of quite tragic universe. So then we also need kind of comic contrapoint. So there was kind of all levels of. And also the end, like the emptying the stage and then having just a violin and the cello, was basically something that was maybe decided the last 2-3 days. But it had been an older idea by the composer to have the cello and violin kind of mirroring the relationship on stage, but then it was never developed or used. But then again at the end, somebody remembered that might be useful to as a way to end that. What was about this notion of open dramaturgy, that the meaning reveals itself only at the end. I mean, in this particular case, something happened that we hadn't predicted, but that influenced how the piece was read very strongly. In the sense that we had created, the piece was finished, and we had public tryouts. The first public tryout was planned on July the 8th, 2005. And if you remember, like July the 7th, 2005, there were the bombings in the metro bombings in London. So we had created a piece about a dead body on a train and people lamenting it, and it became reality, or at least in the way the reality made that people read it, the first audience really read it also as related to that issue like that, which then charged the piece in an emotional way that we hadn't predicted, and that kept with it until the very last performance in New York 3 years later like that. So there's also this thing about, that the work always dialogues also with the outside world, and that kind of then also influences how things are being received.
Were Sami and Romy brought in from the start, or was it like gradual?
They were kind of quite early. I think Nitin had worked with Akram before, so there was kind of proposal from Akram to work with him again. I don't remember exactly when Anthony came in, but he had been around. He's a dance lover. He had seen a lot of dance. He was also, might have been Sam as well, because he's on their kind of board. That kind of tipped. I mean, often this kind of, how do artists meet? Because by accident, but also because there's some affinity or there's some go between that. Somebody tells somebody like Juliette Binoche and Akram got together because Juliette Binoche kind of, what do you call it, like massotherapist was the wife of a friend of Akram, and that's how they kind of met. And again, there's always a desire. She had a desire to make a dance piece, and so here also I think it was Anthony's desire to work, because he has been, since then he has been working for dance more on a regular basis. But it was decided before the rehearsal process took place, and they were very present also through the process. And again, the music is very important, and as I said, we had like 7 weeks. I think the whole rehearsal process was 3 months, but 7 weeks, so it's like almost 2/3. The musicians were present in the studio, and again, both Ladvi and Akram also have a lot of musical knowledge, so they could direct the musicians even when Nitin was not present. 2 of the original cast of 4 musicians are composers themselves, so they would also be able to kind of, so Nitin again it would be a kind of collaborative, collective process, but with very defined roles, and for sure it's the composer who has at the end, I think, taken in all the commentaries and voices that makes the final decisions. And the same with the sets. Although again, this is kind of one of the beautiful noticed the kind of white tape. Like Anthony hated that tape because it kind of felt like you're making. I mean, my spatial concept become this kind of cheap tennis court or something like that. But both Akram and Larry said we need that tape in order to be able to place ourselves, like to spatial. So there was again sometimes these kind of tensions, and then so there's an art of compromise. And compromise is, personally, I find it something positive. It means that you give up your own position, and that if you both give up your own position, you meet somewhere halfway in a new place.
I have a question about some of the movement vocabulary. Because they're both choreographers, they're both wonderful performers. How did the material emerge? Did they try also to find a compromise in the vocabulary in order to shift so that there was the idiosyncrasies or signature of each could find a kind of a common space, or how did they work?
Well, as I said, they were when they start the actual rehearsal process. There were very clear ideas of movement research, and most of them, one was the author of a particular idea, and I mean, if you know them well enough and you've seen a lot of their work, you could still recognize their identity. And when they developed it, they would develop it together, like really in a dialogue. But in a very early part of the process, as a team, we said, okay, there was some pressure from the outside world, mainly the producers, that them coming together, they would create this complete new kind of unique vocabulary or language. And as a team, we said that that's not what it's about, and it's about keeping the identity of each recognizable alive. And that's also another part of my role as a dramaturg I haven't talked about. I mean, the other thing is that if you have a voice, often the dramaturg is the one that's being invited to write the first text that accompany the performance, like the program text. And again, how do you do that? Because you don't want to describe or fix the interpretation of the piece for future audiences. So my strategy was always more to talk about the process than about the final piece, also because I had to write it when there is no final piece yet. And in this particular case, I wrote explicitly about defending that choice of, it's not about blending language, so it's about keeping each language quite pure in its origins, and more like juxtaposing them. Other comments or questions?
I'm curious about the integration or the process of working with personal experience or personal narrative inside the piece, and also that in relation to moving between more literal or concrete towards abstract expression in the project.
I mean, again, this is a personal belief, and it is shared with most of the choreographers I've worked with, that for me, any kind of art needs an autobiographical element. And that's the autobiographical element that kind of energizes. It is this kind of notion of storytelling. If I tell a story about love in general, nobody will be with me. But if I tell a story about a personal love relationship, I mean, communication will be very different. So that is the starting point. But then it is about the form that you find to kind of transmit that. And that form can be more concrete or more abstract, or it can move from one to the other. There's also this notion that, which is again a level of choice, how much do you reveal, how much do you keep hidden? And especially if you work with other people's, like autobiographical material, it's also something that you have to negotiate. And where, for instance, if you ask your dancers to contribute, they should also have say how much you kind of use that.
When you talk about autobiographical, of course I understand. But if I was to sort of, would that for you include personal perspective, not necessarily personal experience? Like what touches me about something in the outside world that comes and adds to my sensibility?
Yeah.
Yeah,
For
so
sure.
we're not talking necessarily autobiographical as a personally
No, no.
experienced
I'll give you another example.
subject. Yeah.
I'll give you another example. This other piece that we made with Balacin Labé, which is called Incotexport, it was based on the experience of the choreographer of seeing this documentary, which is called Darwin's Nightmare. She was a French, like the Cauchemar de Darwin, which was about the exploitation of Victoria Lake in Africa, and how Western industry implementing new fish that was alien, how it destroyed complete ecology and also the complete human relationships. And it was his kind of seeing that documentary and being completely shocked by it and feeling also completely powerless. That was the inspiration. And that also was kind of reworked, and the final piece had a lot of references to the documentary, but then also it wasn't about the documentary, but it was about his sense of not how do you relate to that. And he was parallel to that, creating that work. He was also writing letters to European Parliament and asking them to look into this. So it was kind of.
And how also do you work with costume or light design?
Again, in this piece, there were separate functions. There was a costume designer who, like costumes for me as a dramaturg is kind of a joke. But I say like, I never have an opinion about costumes because it's so much also negotiating personal taste between the choreographer, the dancers, and everybody else involved. So I think, yeah. The light design here, he's a very well-known Finnish light designer. The light design always comes in late in the process, and then has to, I think he did a great job, and normally his light design is much more dominant, but he had to find something very subtle, and he had to also, light design often has to work very closely together with the scenographer. And like Anthony Gormley, although he was only engaged as a scenographer, he had also, I mean, the whole image was partly of his, so it was not, so there was a lot of negotiation between the light designer and the scenographer of how, what fitted and how these two universes would come together. And again, that is trial and error. At one point they had an idea of having much more shadows, and they even designed this kind of, what do you call it, that you put in front of the spot.
No, in front of the projector.
A gel or a gobo?
Yeah, but
A gobo.
a gobo, they kind of, so they cut like figures out of gobo, so that at one point it would be like hundreds of little shadows, like but then again, you have an idea, you try it, it's like either too much or not enough, or it isn't necessary, and then you throw it away, and you find a balance around these things. This is a good moment to round up.
Sure.
I have one, if you're like interested in discovering a little bit more about these choreographers, I've been conducting a series of what is called the body, I mean, it's still going on. It's called the Body Language Talks in South as well as in London, where I have a 1 hour and a half conversation with the artist about their work. It's not a post-show talks, it's really an event in itself, and we try to open it up to not just to the work, but more general perspectives. There's been already 4 seasons, and we're preparing a 5th one. But the first 2 seasons are published, and like this one with City Lavi, with Akram, but also with Jonathan Burrows, with Tim Etchells from Force Entertainment. There will be one with Anthony next season. So I have these kind of beautiful books. So I'll I hope you, I think you have a library here, so I'll donate it to the
Oh,
library.
fantastic.
You can kind of look them up if you feel like it.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I think we'll end there. And thank you so much for sharing your work with us and participating in our lecture series. Right?